In this video, we're going to discuss the tensions that lead up to the English Civil War and the effect that has for religious life in England. As you might recall from a previous discussion, under the reign of Charles I, there is increasing tension between conformists in the Church of England and so-called Puritans, the debate being over whether or not the Church of England had been fully reformed. It's important to remember that the default point of reference, theologically and doctrinally, is Reformed Protestantism. So the promotion by Charles I and Archbishop William Laud of ceremonial practices and in some ways theological positions that look like they're outside of the Reformed consensus drives this debate. A lot of this debate plays out in the context of Parliament because through the logic of royal supremacy, it is Parliament that is the place where religious bills are ratified or enacted. In 1640, parliamentary elections were held, and many opponents from the Puritan camp are elected to Parliament. Charles I perceives those people as his opponents, and so he does what monarchs have the right to do, which is to dissolve this Parliament, and so before it really meets, and this is then called the so-called short Parliament. Because the dissolving of the Parliament, a new round of elections are held, but the same result happens. The majority of Parliament are from the Puritan camp, and this time Charles is unable to dissolve Parliament, and this leads to the so-called Long Parliament that meets at Westminster in London, at the seat of parliamentary power. At the same time, Laudians, people who support Laud during the short Parliament, draw up something known as the Constitutions and Canons Ecclesiastical. This is an attempt to enact parliamentary law that would require a number of changes that disturb Puritans. So it promotes the doctrine of the divine right of kings to rule into the canons of the church. This is a notion that even people who might have been sympathetic to Charles were quite skeptical about. Also, in this new form of church canon law is something known as the etc. oath, because of its length, that required all ministers within the Church of England to uphold episcopacy as currently practiced in the Church of England, not to seek to change the polity of the Church of England from an episcopal polity to a more reformed Presbyterian polity. And then they also had to swear an oath of loyalty to the present church hierarchy, namely Archbishop William Laud. This round of canonical changes is firmly rejected by Puritans within the Church of England and an emerging movement of Congregationalists, that is, people who tried to exercise church life outside of the context of the Church of England. Following upon that, there is a petition issued in response to these perceived abuses by Charles and William Laud, known as the Root and Branches Petition. So called because it seeks to remove episcopal polity by the root and the branches from the Church of England. This is obviously a petition promoted by Puritans. It's signed by 10,000 citizens of London, which is a significant number. It's presented to Parliament by 1,500 middle-class citizens who appear. There is a lot of dis-ease by those in leadership about the class dynamics at play here, that there might be a lower class, even if it's a merchant class, appearing to perhaps be rejecting episcopal authority. and a real discomfort with the nature of the religious demands made in there. It sends a real shockwave through the church hierarchy. And this becomes the model for other anti-episcopal petitions that appear in other English cities in the same year. So if a generation earlier we had evidence for widespread support of Catholicism, even as people like Henry or Edward are changing it from above, now we have evidence of fairly significant discontent with the Church of England and ceremonial practices and polity that might have in the past looked quite Catholic. The grievances in the Root and Branches petitions are worth mentioning because they help to set the foundation for the war that is to come. One is that their Laud had issued a ban on the preaching of Calvinist doctrines like predestination and election, and people with Puritan views are not being placed in ministry positions, are certainly being excluded from high-ranking church positions and prominent churches. There had been a teaching in Laud's circles around the notion that the Roman Church, even if in error, is a true church. This was roundly rejected by Puritans as a sign of real error in the teachings of the Church of England. Moreover, the ceremonials and liturgies being promoted in the Church of England in the court of William Laud at the King's Court just look too much like Roman ceremonial and liturgy. It feels wrong to them. It's a sign that the church is in need of further reform. They reject the very harsh discipline meted out to those who resist Laud's vision of church life. This involved forms of corporal punishment, such as the cropping of ears, that is where the top of the ear is cut off. And they reject this notion that the office of the bishop, episcopal polity, is somehow divinely ordained by God in Scripture. And they argue instead that a Congregationalist or Presbyterian model really is what's found in Scripture. In response to this, conformists, those who want the Church of England to remain as it is, make a number of points. One is they argue that the authority of bishops is apostolic in origin. They make this tight link between the first apostles and the bishops who follow, and that bishops exist to secure apostolic teaching. They defend the ceremonial and liturgy of the Church of England by appealing to the Book of Common Prayer and naming that there were Protestant martyrs for this prayer book, the martyrs under Mary. So they argued the Book of Common Prayer and its authority has been secured in a way by the blood of martyrs. They lean into this notion that Puritan and Presbyterian views might lead to an undermining of royal authority itself. That is, if the best model of governance for church is local, they might and reject the notion of a bishop over the church. This might lead to rejecting the notion of a monarch over a nation. And so they promote Elizabeth and James I, Charles's father, as models of righteous, godly ruling and show how that flowed out of their support of the prayer book and episcopacy. And to inoculate themselves against this notion that they are too sympathetic with the Roman Catholic Church, they also reject the so-called superstitions of the papacy and roundly condemn the papacy. There's an image here that we can look on. It's from a text known as the Shepherd's Oracle, and it's quite striking for the way in which it lays out an image of what godly rule perhaps ought to look like. And so we'll spend some time in class breaking this down, but on the left is King Charles, and we can spend some time reflecting on how this is a piece of royal and episcopal propaganda, to try to counter things like the Root and Branches Petition. It certainly gives us the sense of a church and a nation teetering on the brink of conflict. And that conflict comes to just a year or so after the dissolving of Parliament and the Root and Branches Petition, with a rebellion in Ireland in 1641 by the Catholic population there against the Anglo-Protestant rulers and settlers. By this point, Ireland has been conquered by England and is in a vassal relationship to England. There's the attack by the Irish rebels against English rule includes attacks on women and children, massacres, and there is very much outrage in England over these events. And of course, it has the tinge of a Catholic-Protestant conflict as well. England never got involved in the 30 Years' War to protect Protestants in Europe. And now there is a wondering if Charles can be trusted to even protect his own people against Catholics in Ireland. Remember, his wife, Henrietta Marie, is French Catholic. And so there's this real distrust now emerging over whether Charles cares enough and is competent and maybe isn't a secret agent, and can he then lead an army against Catholic rebels? And so a civil war breaks out over this question of Charles's trustworthiness as a Protestant king to protect Protestant citizens. And so it's a civil war rooted in this question of which side is the proper heir and guardian of the Reformation in England. In 1643, a Presbyterian synod known as the Westminster Assembly meets in London and produces what's known as the Westminster Confession, which is Presbyterian and Calvinist in its content. And it does this seeing itself as the logical next step in reforming the Church of England. So while the Westminster Confession is labeled Presbyterian, in some ways it's appropriate to see it as a continuation of one vision or a continuing activity of a part of the Church of England. The 39 Articles are named, for instance, as foundational for the Westminster Confession as a document and for the religious views expounded in it. Historically, the Westminster Confession has no status in the Church of England, but it's very influential in the Church of Scotland and Scottish Presbyterianism, and thus in Presbyterianism as found in the United States. In the context of this war, in 1645, Archbishop William Laud is arrested and executed for his crimes and harassments of Puritans. In 1649, as the English Civil War ends, Charles I himself is arrested. He's put on trial. And then he's executed for waging war against his own people. And so let's just think about this for a bit. In 1533, King Henry VIII, by the act of supremacy, is made the supreme head of the Church of England. And then, about 115 years later, Charles, the supreme head of the Church of England, is executed. And only 4 years before, his archbishop had. And so we can have a sense of a real reversal of the trajectory of the Church of England and of the project of royal supremacy, torn apart by this debate about how far and whether the Church of England should continue its reform agenda. There then emerges, between the years 1649 and 1660, a period known as the Interregnum, or the period between monarchs. Here, England becomes a republic. It's declared a commonwealth, and the general of the army, a Presbyterian, Oliver Cromwell becomes Lord Protector. There is a rebellion by Scotland and Ireland that continues during this time period, and so there's the need for constant military force, a constant presence of the army throughout the British Isles and Ireland. The Book of Common Prayer is banned during this period of time, and it's replaced by a document known as the Directory for Public Worship. During this period of the English Commonwealth, we can find the rise of denominationalism. That is that various groups from outside the Church of England begin to take shape as formal entities. Congregationalists, Baptists, Quakers. The Church of England has become disestablished, and this has allowed other people to form their own religious affiliations. In some ways, this is seen as very kind of disruptive to the common life of England. I have this broadside illustration for you that, again, we can discuss in class, titled The Catalog of Sects, and you can read it. It has all these different people: Jesuits, Arminians, Arians, Adamites, Libertines, Soul Sleepers, Anabaptists, so on and so forth. We can work to decipher this, but you can get the sense that a real kind of chaos that might be emerging in this time religiously, at least by some critics. So now what's been unleashed is the notion of religious liberty. And this notion of religious liberty is going to have serious effects as we move into the Enlightenment era and then into the context of English colonial life in the American colonies. Episcopalian conformist worship, or Anglicanism, continues to occur in parish contexts and household contexts. If you're far enough away from an army outpost or from you're in a rural context where officials can't really observe you, your parish might still have continued worship according to the Book of Common Prayer. In other contexts, people still met secretly in houses to continue prayer book worship. Episcopacy is strongly suppressed, but there is strong evidence for the continued activity of bishops in the southern part of England and in the eastern parts of England. The region around Oxford is another prominent site where we know episcopacy thrives. As well, Cromwell not only allows for a lot of Christian religious experimentation, but he also readmits the Jews to England in 1656. They had been expelled at the end of the 13th century and had been banned from any formal life in England, except for the existence of some traders here and there in the context of London. But he readmits them in 1656 as part of his own vision of an end-time scenario where all Jews need to convert to Christianity before Christ will return. But this readmission of Jews to England will also have a serious influence on English religious life broadly, and signals, again, a way in which notions of religious toleration are beginning to work their ways into Protestant European Christianity and will have a significant form of playing out as we move into a discussion of the Enlightenment project. So we have some interesting dynamics here to look at. A suppression of one form of Christianity that paradoxically allows for other forms of Christianity to flourish. I think we have a lot to consider and talk about here, and I look forward to our future conversation.